the Army, the Community and National Defence, Envisaging the Future. Please welcome to the stage Professor Duncan Lewis and Professor Rory Medcalf.
Chief of Army, Simon Stewart, Flag and General Ranking Officers, RSM of the Army, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and most particularly the serving members of the Australian Army that are in the room today. Good morning, and Simon, could I thank you for the very kind invitation to be here. I hope you'll excuse me when I use the words we and us when I refer to Army. I loved the Army for 30-something years while I was in uniform. I still love the Army, I always will. And it's a bit hard for me to talk about you and we, so excuse me as I exchange those expressions when I speak. It's a great privilege to be here today. The importance of these symposiums don't escape me. It's a very important time to take all of you, those in uniform, men and women of action, to take a little time out of your work life to become men and women of contemplation, to think and reflect deeply on your profession and where your Army is going. I'm going to speak very briefly about just 4 things, and then we'll get into conversation. Rory will speak and we'll do some question and answer. I want to talk briefly about Army connectivity. I want to talk about the current strategic situation as I see it. I want to talk about the Defence Strategic Review and the National Defence Strategy from my perspective. And then finally, I'll come back to talk about you and your particular challenges in Army. Just being here for the previous session, it looks like it's all been said. It just hasn't been said by Rory and myself yet. So we will do that now. Army's connectivity, you all know the history. The first half of the last century, we had 2 major world wars fought largely by citizen soldiers. Those citizen soldiers then matured and went on to become leaders in the community, leaders in industry. Some of them became prime ministers, ministers of the Crown. And we had very strong connectivity between, the citizen army that it was and the community. That atrophied, of course, during particularly the last quarter of the last century, the creation of a professional army, a small professional army, which was involved in wars offshore, distant wars, some of them quite secretive. Most of those conflicts did not impact the Australian community much at all, perhaps with the exception of Vietnam with conscription, which was a big issue for kind of everybody, particularly those that were chosen. But most of the conflicts have been fought overseas where the Army has been out of sight and out of mind. And so our connectivity is not as good as it could be. But having said that, I mean, we still have these very strong sinews into the community through the Army Reserve, which is very strongly represented here this morning. We've got the Australian Cadet Corps, of course. We've got all the advertising, the recruiting that goes on, the open days and so forth. And the greatest exposure you probably get is through your presence at emergencies, when there is emergency in the community, floods and fires and so forth. I know during COVID there was a lot of anxiety within the armed forces, and I share it to a degree, about the misuse, of servicemen and women in certain roles to support the community. But I've got to tell you, as a citizen looking at it from the outside, that's the time when you most value the Army, because they've come to help, and so that gives you great kudos and great leverage. The community's changed in the last 30 to 40 years. We all know that. There's been a combination of factors that have done this. Migration, I think 27% of Australians are now not born in Australia. 50% of Australians have a parent born overseas, so migration has changed the face of Australia. We've got issues of prosperity. We are infinitely more prosperous than we were sort of 30, 40 years ago. We are better educated. There are high levels of education in the society. There's a social safety net here, which is amazing. We spend 6 times as much on social services and welfare as we do on defence. It's a factor of 6. We have an enviable medical safety net in this country. We spend 2.5 times as much on medicine and medical attention as we do on defence. These are all good things, but I just want to get it into perspective. Housing standards, notwithstanding the current controversy over availability, the housing standards are very high. There is availability of money through loans. I heard earlier about the superannuation funds. I mean, we've got, by 2030, we will have the second largest superannuation funds in the world, behind the United States. $3 trillion tied up US in superannuation. That's a massive amount of money for a country to have, as part of its kind of sovereign wealth. So these things have all changed the society, but what it's created, in my view, is an insouciance. I use that word. It's an insouciance towards national security. There's a sense of, you'll enjoy this, I'm the chairman of Thales. You see, I've got to use these French words particularly when I'm in Paris. But insouciance, there is a sort of a calmness, there's a sense of well-being. It's okay, we don't need to worry. We're isolated, we're a long way from the world, and if something does happen, the Americans will come and save us. Well, we all know that has changed. And that brings me really to the second point I wanted to talk about, which was the issue of the strategic circumstances that we face right now. We're in a period, as you all know, of great power rivalry that's happening globally, but in particular it's happening in the Asia-Pacific. We are in a period of a breakdown in the global rules, the rules-based global order. Okay, there is a breakdown in those rules. They were established after World War II. Now they are being challenged and changed. We as a middle power have benefited from those rules for the last 70 years. Now the rules are being changed and it's not so much in our favour, potentially, as these rules are being adjusted, so we need to pay attention to that. The third thing is that democracy itself is under challenge. That compact between the governed and the government in a democratic society where there is a sort of a unsaid promise of escalating prosperity through time, that has broken down. And the middle classes in many of the Western democracies have not improved their lot over the last 20 or 30 years. That's causing friction together with the alienated minorities that we have in our communities. There's a disenfranchisement among large slabs of the community. You can see it on the television every night in this country and in others. So that has all changed. China itself, we all obsess, and as we probably should, about China. It is pushing out. I like to use that expression, pushing out. It's both figurative and physically. It's pushing out. Nothing strange about that. Every great power does it. The United States has been doing it for the last 70 years. The British Empire did it before that. The Romans a couple of thousand years ago. All powers push out in order to shape the world to suit themselves. They want to form a world that is conducive to their interests. And that is precisely what China is doing right now. 2,000 years ago, Thucydides reminded us that in a world without rules, the strong will do as they will, and the weak will suffer as they must. And if you're a Ukrainian, you'd probably be reflecting on that comment right now. The world's not a comfortable place for Australia, and we need to make haste to marshal our national resources, our economic resources, diplomatic, administrative resources, human resources, technical and industrial resources, and our military resources. This is a whole of nation endeavour. We need to pull all this together. I am not a proponent of the view that war is inevitable. I think that's a load of rubbish, and it's also dangerous. It's very dangerous to start from that point. It is well within the wit of man to avoid war, but you would be imprudent not to start preparing for headwinds, strategic headwinds, that are blowing now and will increase, in my view, over the coming years. Now, I've publicly asked the question, are we moving far enough and are we moving fast enough in order to meet these future headwinds? A few words on DSR, National Defence Strategy. The DSR, wonderful document. I think Peter Dean might have been here yesterday, one of the co-leads on that. I happen to agree with all of the judgments and the findings in the DSR. I think it's wonderful. I'm less comfortable about the National Defence Strategy, the NDS. I asked twice for Defence to include a chapter in that document which went to the issue of national resilience. That is, what was the society going to do to support a defence force that's deployed, and who is going to arbitrate and how between what effort goes to the Defence Force and what effort remains with the society, which needs to continue. You can't just stop doing what you're doing. The ambulances have to run. Perhaps not as numerous and as frequent, but society has to continue. That request was rejected twice, and the document does not have such a chapter in it now, and I think that's a gap. That brings you very quickly to talk about a national security strategy, which Rory and I at the National Defence College and our colleagues talk about interminably. I tried to get a national security strategy up with about 5 different governments in my various capacities. 2 Prime Ministers pushed the document back across the desk and looked at me as though I was an idiot and said, well, we're not going to support this because it's going to cost a lot of money. 1 Prime Minister did actually take up the cudgel, Prime Minister Gillard, and we produced a national security strategy in 2013. It was pretty weak, pretty pathetic kind of thing. It was 27 pages long. It was a sort of a once over lightly. But we need to get very serious about this issue now and have a national security strategy which brings all of the sinews of government together. Let me turn to the issue, sorry, before I go on, the last session we talked about industry. Could I commend to you a book? It's called Freedom's Forge. Some of you may know it. Please read Freedom's Forge. It's written by a guy by the name of Arthur Herman. It was published about 12 years ago. And it's the story about how American business delivered victory in World War II. Roosevelt gathered around him a small group of industrialists, and they put together the plan which marshalled the whole might of the United States, its society, its industry, everything else, to produce the goods. Freedom's Forge by Arthur Herman. 2/3 of all equipment produced in World War II was produced, for the Allies, was produced by the United States. Let me give you some figures. 86,000 tanks, 2.5 million trucks, 500,000 jeeps, a staggering 286,000 combat aircraft. Just think about that. 8,800 naval vessels and 41 billion rounds of ammunition of all natures. Now, this is not World War II. We are not the United States. I get all that. But if you adjust that for scale, it's cause for pause. It's cause for reflection. How would we stack up? Quite aside from industrial capacity, how are we organised at the highest level nationally for conflict? You all know about the National Security Committee of Cabinet. I had the privilege of sitting inside that august body for 14 years. I've watched governments of both persuasions plying their trade in the NSC, and I can tell you that it is not fit for a conflict situation. It works perfectly well for what we have now, but it will not cut it for conflict. It will require extraordinary bolstering and or change in format in order to do it. We've had war cabinets in the past. The last war cabinet we had, World War II, didn't have the states and territories represented. Mr Morrison, with COVID, brought together the national cabinet. You know, that worked very well. All the states and territories went off and did whatever they wanted to do anyway. So how are we going to set up a structure which is going to... Who is in charge? It's a great question. It's a good question for an army to ask. Who is in charge of this? The Prime Minister doesn't have it written on his door, but he should have really a sign written there, Prime Minister and Minister for National Security. You know, it would be nice if that was written on there. It might bring some focus. But I just make that point. Finally, coming back to you, then I'm going to finish. The Chief, your Chief of Army, gave 3 challenges last year in a speech that he made towards the back end of last year. He talked about the challenge you have of jurisdiction, the challenge you have of expertise, and the challenge you have of self-regulation. I was very attracted to this because it's not dissimilar to the big end of town or, in fact, small and medium enterprises. Industry works along a similar sort of line. The company that I have the privilege of chairing has, you know, where the Chief talks about jurisdiction, we talk about licence. We have a licence to operate. We do have a licence to operate as an industry. Where the Chief talks about expertise, we talk about skills, the development of skills to deliver the product or the service that we're delivering. And where the Chief talks about self-regulation, we have a regulatory framework in which we have to operate to keep us legal and to keep us on the straight and narrow. Your licence to operate comes from the Australian people and from the Australian government. Your expertise always requires attention, and particularly, as we discussed in the last session, the adaptation that's required in the fast-moving technological journey that we're on. We're galloping along and we need to be adaptive for that. The good news is that you have an enviable training system, the best that I've ever seen anywhere. The training system that the Australian Army has is a very good one, and it's envied by many. Your procurement system is still very much in need of surgery. It is not delivering what the government wants, and there is much more to be done, and we are very conscious on the industry side of the house about this. We want to work hard on that problem. The regulatory framework is critical. You must embrace your command accountability. That's what the community expects. Your integrity as an organisation is good, but it needs constant attention and to be preserved and presented. Your image must be defended. You need to remain open and accessible to the wider community. There is a sense of a sort of a enclave, a military enclave, and you need, as an organisation, to be reaching out more than you do. Unfortunately, when it comes to national security, it's kind of only folk like you who think about it. The rest of the population out there either don't know or, more hurtfully, they don't care. And so you do need to reach outside your lane and think about, well, what is the rest of society going to do to support your efforts? So it's not so much about where your army has been, but it's about where your army is going. Good luck. I will finish talking there. Thank you.
Well, Duncan, thank you. That was, I think that was inspiring, and I'm going to build on those remarks, amplify a few, maybe challenge one or two as well, so we can have a really robust conversation. And look, I'd also echo not only my acknowledgement of thanks to the Chief of Army for this symposium and for this very important contribution to the national conversation, as well as for the transformation of Army. But I also want to thank all of the other speakers and panellists here, but particularly to thank and acknowledge all of you who serve Australia. So I'll touch on a few of the themes of the session that we're embarking on now. So national defence, the community, the place of Army in relation to both national defence and the Australian community, but also that key question about the future. And a word that's not in the title of the session, but I think is implicit in all of this, is are we ready? Are we prepared for the future risks of the strategic environment? I'll get straight to the punchline, and the answer is no. But I think Australia is at the early stages of a very serious journey to become more prepared, and I think the national conversation that this is part of is going to be absolutely key to our success in that endeavour. When we work on the, I guess, development of the leadership of the Australian national security community at the National Security College, we often start with thinking about the whole concept of security, you know, winding back for a moment to think, well, what is this often undefined term or concept that is at the core of our business? And that relates further then to the question of the management of risk, protecting Australia's interests and values. I think way of life is a term that was used yesterday. And it's important just to recap a few of those thoughts, because security is not some sort of absolute. Security is not some sort of understanding where those of you who are professionals in your service to the national interest somehow provide 100% guaranteed security for the nation, and somehow the rest of the community, the rest of the public can sort of opt out and treat that as not their business. Because when you start looking more deeply at the history of this, and even the very notion of security, there is something about that relationship between the citizen and the state. I think Duncan and others have referred to that. And in fact, if you go back to the origin of security, it is really a state of mind. You know, it literally means without care. And that doesn't mean that threats will not touch your country or your society, but it means that through your preparedness and through your capabilities and your vigilance, you've actually achieved a state of mind where, as a society, as a nation, you're managing your fears, you're managing your anxieties by engaging with risk. And so I think that's really at the core of what having prepared national capability is all about. Army is central to that, but of course there are so many other elements as well, and it's not only the ADF, but it's also that question of the civil agency, civil preparedness, and what's the contribution of the rest of the community. And I think that in the strategic environment that I think Duncan's already referred to and we've had alluded to repeatedly during the past 2 days, the fact that geopolitical risks to Australia's interests, to our national identity, to our values are gathering. We are in the most challenging era for strategic risk since the 1940s, and we have to take that seriously. That's not simply a kind of political slogan that we can sort of fire and forget. In that environment, as a middle power, we actually have to make use of all the capabilities that we have. And although at the one level you could say that looking at Australia's geography, our interests far outweigh our capability as a nation of 27 million people to protect those interests, and therefore we need to rely very heavily on partnerships and alliances, and we do rely on those. We also need to make use of what we have. And I think that the challenge for the Australian polity in the years ahead is to make much more effective use of the latent capability that we have, and to do that in ways that are consistent with our character as a liberal democracy, and indeed a federated liberal democracy at that. So I think when thinking about the future of army and society in Australia, we have to be thinking constantly about all of those points of potential and actual points of contact with the broader community, with civil society, with industry, with states and territories, and beyond. Look, I'll amplify, I guess, a few of the key messages Duncan's made about the risks that we face, and I think it's really important to move away from a mindset that somehow in the years ahead it's going to be a choice either between total war or total peace. The fact is that we have this very textured landscape of risk already. I mean, even as we saw, in the last 24 hours, there are hostile foreign actors at work on Australian soil, and thankfully, in the case of what's been uncovered and responded to by Iran over the last few days, those risks we like to think our systems can detect and react and respond, but we need to assume that there's lots more happening out there. And I think what we focus on at the National Security College when we look holistically at security risk to Australia is that it's not irrelevant at all whether Australia finds itself to be a belligerent in conflict or a frontline actor in a plausible future conflict in our region. Of course, that would be absolutely profoundly critical to our security, whether there was a major power conflict in the region and Australia was a belligerent. But even in circumstances where we are not, Australia's interests, values and identity are going to be deeply impacted immediately with the outbreak of conflict in our region. So I think that somehow building a much more confident national conversation where preparedness is about the entire continuum of risk and not simply about some of the hypotheticals that media or certain former politicians like to talk about, as either we're going to stand back from a conflict in the region or somehow be a frontline player. I think that's the real conversation. And where I will gently challenge a conversation with Duncan is the question of community engagement on those issues, because as in fact Duncan is working with the National Security College at the moment on our engagement with the community, and we are on a really quite an ambitious set of engagements, opinion polling, face-to-face meetings, a submission process around the country, hundreds of conversations so far and probably a few hundred more to have. We're trying to build a textured picture, to map a picture of Australian attitudes to security. And the good news is that it's actually a very mixed picture. And although I can't and shouldn't sort of disclose any of our data at this stage because we have polling still underway and we don't want to jeopardise that by describing what we know so far, what I would say is that a lot of Australians are thinking about security. It's just that in many cases they're not thinking about security as security. They're thinking about it as something else. So this concept of resilience that we've talked about the past few days, I think the idea of having a society that is protecting its democratic institutions or that it's protecting itself from deliberate disinformation or the sowing of division, a society that's protecting itself from threats to its economic well-being, supply chains, critical infrastructure and so forth, recognition that security is also about the impacts of climate change or the impacts on a sustainable way of life. All of that has some resonance somewhere in the Australian public. The big challenge, and where I do agree quite strongly with Duncan, is that it's going to require a certain new national narrative to pull all that together and to actually try to translate that into a willingness across the community to be part of the solution to Australia's national security challenges, to be thinking about responsibilities as well as risks. So watch this space. We will be releasing findings from our community consultations early next year, and there is a submissions process open. So if you have, not necessarily as service personnel, but if you have people that you know who are not in the ADF who may be interested in, for example, sharing their view on what they think the security risks facing Australia are, around the country, members of the community, ordinary Australians, we would love to hear from them. We have a consultation paper online and we are inviting submissions. So I think feel free to spread the word. Look, just to wrap up, I might say something about, firstly, the question of how do we nest a national response in a broader national strategy that is not purely the defence strategy. And also just to make an observation about where to look internationally for, I think, if not best practice, then ideas or practices that we can borrow from. I'm glad that Duncan Lewis made the point about a national security strategy. I think the national defence strategy is a significant advance. I think the DSR, the National Defence Strategy, they're all, I think, absolutely worthwhile and necessary framings of Australia's policy responses to very difficult strategic environment. But I think it doesn't make sense to do that without nesting it under a more comprehensive national security strategy. And there are plenty of reasonably logical reasons as to why any national security strategy is going to be imperfect, it's going to be politically difficult, it's going to have challenges on resourcing, it's going to be out of date the moment that it's put into print. None of those are reasons not to proceed, because I think in many ways, by having a national defence strategy as the overall framing document, we run the risk that there'll be misperceptions in the community that we are making defence and a military response the core of our national security response, whereas in many ways it is that, as we've heard over the past few days, it is that vital and only instrument of last resort, but there are many civil responses that need to be marshalled as well, whether it's in cyber security or the role of the private sector or even the role of states and territories. So I'd certainly encourage more thinking about, if we don't have a formal national security strategy, how do we at least have the elements of a national security strategy in government's outward-facing policy articulations and in coordinating responses across government, in communicating to the community the risks we face in the strategic environment and the responses that we need as a nation. I think one of the most useful lines I've heard in the past 24 hours was a very thoughtful observation, I think at a special session last night by the distinguished British security historian Hugh Strawn, where he talked about national resilience as an element of deterrence. In other words, if you have a society and a nation that ahead of a threat can demonstrate that it's willing to absorb and withstand shocks, it is going to have a deterrent effect on any adversary that would contemplate coercion or the use of force. The last observation I'll make is that it is time for Australia to be looking as creatively as it can internationally at practices and ideas that we can develop as we sharpen our security capabilities, as we modernise our forces, and as we try to build a national conversation. At the college, we've done a lot of work on engagement with the Nordic and Baltic countries, which I think have shown really the leading edge on this certainly in the European strategic environment. And I think that we can get beyond the assumption that you have to be a frontline state to be a country that decides to harness more of its capability for defence and security, that you have to wait until you're sort of on the border with an aggressive Russia before you worry about that sort of thing. I think that the lesson absorbed from whether it's the Finnish or Swedish or some of the Baltic experiences is there are all sorts of ways in a very democratic framework you can encourage more of your society to take an interest, to play a part in defence and security. A lot of that is through education. And I think one sort of gold standard piece that I take away from my own research in that environment is the National Defence course in Finland, where the leaders of parliament, business, civil society, unions, churches, a very broad community, each year conduct an intense educational program where not only are they building their awareness of defence and security, but also their roles and responsibilities in a crisis. And therefore you've got effectively an instant network that can be activated in the event of a national security crisis. We work hard at the National Security College, but we're not there yet. So that's a standard to aspire to. And I think in closing, all of this is to say that your own role, your own commitment, your own mission is incredibly important to Australia's interests. And I think that we're on a path where, in the years to come, your engagement with the broader Australian community is going to make a fundamental difference. So thank you, and join me and Duncan for some questions. Thank you. See what we've got.
You've got the machine.
I've got the machine, but if there are hands in the room, we might start with those because I might be a little bit slow on the tech. I don't think we've got any online questions yet. You got one? Yeah.
Mick.
Go for it. Yeah.
I applaud your comments on consultation and involving community and having a rethink around the narrative in terms of being prepared to be resilient. I've been very fortunate to have gone across the north of Australia and talked to all of the local leaders. I've been in Burraloula on Pension Day. I've survived night time in Halls Creek. But one of the issues that they came back with routinely was that they're not actually engaged in the planning for their own security and defence to a level that was adequate to satisfy their leadership. And some of those comments came from people that had experienced a significant uptick in defence activity through the north of Australia in the 80s and 90s, where they were intimately involved in planning for vital asset protection, defining how the Army and Defence could work with society. And others, interestingly, came from the traditional owners as well, where they had inherited and also legally obtained ownership for the lands that they live on. And they wanted to be involved in the defence of their land, which I know the Reserve Forces Surveillance Group does a lot of work on. But my point is it actually needs to go beyond the consultation and the strategic narrative. There's enormous distrust of what comes out of Canberra, out in the regions. So I just wondering if I could get you to comment on how is it possible to get to that stage? And what's the pathway to getting to that stage?
You go first, because I'm going to get some tech assistance on this device while...
Yeah, Mick, I think you bring to our attention that the anxiety over defence is sort of directly proportional with the distance from Canberra. And so the most anxious folks that I've encountered over sort of half a century in this business have been in the north and the extreme west of the country. I am a West Australian, and we are, as a kind of a species of people over there, kind of apoplectic about defence and security. I think the point you're making is very important. I would add to that also the protection of the mineral extraction resources in the sort of top left-hand corner of the country. That requires some very serious thought, and the state governments get particularly anxious about that. I was part of the 80s and 90s, and there are some of us in the room here who were dashing around the northern parts of the country in those years, where we did make a deliberate effort to, look at sort of continental defence. I think we have a responsibility in government to address the anxiety of these people. But I suspect we'll never be able to completely satisfy their needs. So there is a requirement for a discussion. I agree with you. And this is part of, and I'll throw to Rory now, this is part of the purpose of the National Security College's survey. Is to include societies such as that and find out where the hotspots are around the place, because the views are not uniform across the country at all.
I would just add a couple of thoughts to that. Firstly, I think I can say that we're already detecting certainly a stronger set of anxieties or risk awareness in sort of parts of Australia that are closer to the region, that are sort of in the west and the north, and that I was actually relieved to discover that that's the mindset, because it's realistic. There's no complacency the sort of closer you get to our north. Having said that, I get the sense from a lot of our discussions so far that what people are wanting at this stage, sure, they actually, for a start, I'm pleasantly surprised that a lot of them like the fact that we're doing consultations. They're not sort of scratching their heads and say, why are you talking to us? I think there is an appetite to be consulted, but there's also a massive appetite for information. And I think that what we are also detecting is that there is a stronger appetite for clearer and more detailed signalling from government about expectations on communities and expectations on Australian society in the event of security risk. I see that as a first step before you then go to that, I think, more complex question of how do you actually involve the rest of the country in planning. But I think that's, I think we can and should be taking these early steps. I've got a lot of questions here on the screen, but we'd love to get one or two more from the room first. So why don't we do that? We'll take that, and we'll take yours as well. Yeah, thank you.
Corporal Spence, AWSU, Horsham. Professor Lewis, you mentioned the resilience of the civilian society in relation to supporting the Defence Force in a time of war or crisis. What would this resilience look like to you, and what can the society start to do to support the Defence Force?
Yeah, Corporal Spence, thanks very much. I think Rory might have described it from the podium here. What I would see is that it is a state of mind. It's a state of mind in the society that we need to be harder than we are. We need to harden this whole country. Now, I'm not suggesting some sort of, we're not going to do this in one hit, and it's not going to be done in an instant. It will require a long and hard discussion between government and the people, and between industry and the government, and among the people. My concern is that a succession of Australian governments have not shown much of an inclination to talk about it. They would rather not, because inevitably it comes back to defence and the cost. It's a cost thing. But if you go to, and Rory's an expert on this, you go to a place like Finland, and I'm taking the European Australian Business Council, which I happen to chair. We're going there next year. I've organised for them to go to Finland to show a series of Australian business leaders, we'll have 30 or 40 business leaders, what a country looks like that has a high level of resilience. Now, we are not Finland, we don't have a 1,500 kilometre border with Russia, but the lessons that the Finns have to offer us are significant in terms of our hardening. And it's hardening in the mind and everything that we do. because we're very vulnerable. Modern societies are extremely vulnerable to all kinds of vector attacks, far more than we were 100 years ago. The vectors of cyber and space and everything else have been added to the vectors of, coming across land or coming across water and doing you harm. And unfortunately, the vectors of cyber and space are instantaneous in terms of their effect. And they're relatively cheap and often non-attributable. So you've got all sorts of complications. We are very vulnerable as a modern technical society. Look, there's been some great work done in Home Affairs. Been some great work done in the legislation around protecting critical infrastructure and so on. But there needs to be a change in mindset.
I would just add to that. As I said, the Finnish experience is pretty extraordinary because they've had the decades-long, century of strategic, of existential risk from Russia. So I think every part of the community, every household is kind of mindful of that. But there are other countries we can look at that are perhaps a halfway house, and so I think Sweden's a really interesting example because Sweden's sort of bouncing back to become more resilient after, I think, letting its national security wane a bit over the years. And a lot of what they're doing is very information-based. So, for example, imagine if every household had, a very basic checklist of what do you do, how do you operate in the event in society that, we have economic supply lines cut for a number of days, the internet's down, there's nothing on the shelves in the supermarket, you have no fuel, all of those things that within days or weeks could be realities in a situation where critical infrastructure is under attack, in circumstances that may even be short of major war. And I think just having confidence in communities about how to respond, and I think that goes to that question about community preparedness in remote areas, would be a step change in genuine national resilience. And in fact, it would not be rocket science. It would not be logistically impossible to do. It's really an educational piece. So I think they're some of the early steps that can be taken without, suggesting that somehow we want to turn Australia into Sparta. And this has got to be done in a consensual, liberal, democratic framework where actually parliamentarians become really transmission belts for that kind of national conversation.
That's a good question. Thank you.
Question here, I think.
Yeah, Major General Sue Graham. So I think my question builds on your answers in that requires an enduring, consistent narrative. And so how does Army influence that without it being seen as an Army issue to own and Army supporting rather than leading?
I have a strong view on this, Sue, thank you. And it goes back to one of those comments I made from the podium. I know that if you take up the cudgel, it looks like you're self-serving. But there's nobody else will take up the cudgel. And there's nobody else that is as well qualified to speak about what the needs are, even outside your lane, as you are. This is a sad reality. And this is the problem we had with the DSR. The DSR is, I describe it, it's like a self-licking ice cream. It's a magnificent thing in itself, but it's not looking at the lanes within which it's operating. And that's a problem. So I would encourage you all to not be apprehensive about advocacy, but to get out there and advocate. And there are ways of doing it. I mean, you don't need to be obnoxious about it or whatever. There are ways of doing it. But within this room, and if I was sitting in front of the Navy or the Air Force, or for that matter, the Australian Public Service, or some parts of the Department of Foreign Affairs and other bits that are associated with this, I would be saying the same thing. Get out and advocate, because Joe Sixpack out there doesn't know and doesn't care. And this discussion needs to be given more air. Thank you.
I'm going to jump on a few of the online questions we've got, and Duncan, I'm going to read out 3 of them, because at least one of them is one that I don't feel qualified to answer, and I'm sure. There's a few actually. There's a few very Army-specific questions, but there's one about national industry that I will go to. So I'm going to throw 3 at you. I'll answer 2 of them and then see if you want to answer all or any of them. How is the Army viewed from across the other government departments? 1. 2, if Army is to be visible and accessible to the community, is it time to bring back travelling in uniform? And 3, does national industry have a social responsibility for national defence? And my own views on those, particularly on the third one, national industry, I think the thing that strikes me about our national security effort generally, and this is as someone who's probably spent a lot of time living and working outside of Canberra, so metropolitan Sydney and elsewhere, you soon realise how much of Australia's economy and how much of our capability and our human capital is in the private sector, motivated by, I don't know if Matt's still here. Oh, there we are. Yes, return. But look, we do have a very dynamic capitalist economy, and we do have enormous parts of society who pursue their careers in the private sector and are very talented. That does not necessarily make those people unpatriotic. It just means that they haven't, I guess, as institutions or individuals, haven't been integrated into a national defence or national security effort. Does that mean that there's some kind of social responsibility there? I think the first step, in my mind, is the conversation. So it certainly has to happen at executive level. CEOs, I kind of, I'm interested perhaps in your views, Matt, but it still surprises me how few of the leadership of the Australian private sector hold security clearances or are sort of somehow brought into trusted national security conversations when effectively they are leaders of just about all of the critical infrastructure that we would need in a crisis. Whether you need to turn that into some sort of compellence or requirement that they have an obligation, or whether it can be an appeal, a sort of an informed appeal to their patriotic instincts, I don't know, but I think we are a long way from sort of a good standard on that, except in some sectors, and cybersecurity is obviously one of those sectors. That's my view on that one, but Duncan, there's 3 questions, 2 of them about Army. What are your thoughts?
I won't answer the second one about travelling in uniform. That's a matter for the Chief of the Army. It's a matter for the uniformed Australian Defence Force to address. So, but look, I would make the observation, obviously, that if travelling in uniform means that you're increasing the presence and the visibility of Army without endangering the individuals in it, then I think it's a damn good thing. But to go to the first point, which is what does the rest of government think about Army? This is a really interesting thing. I've spent a lot of time on both sides of the fence here. The rest of the public service, and this is a gross generalisation, but the rest of the public service regards the Army as being professional. It regards it as being pretty good. They're amazed when you get involved in planning. Whenever other government departments are trying to do any sort of planning and somebody turns up in uniform, an Army a service member turns up in uniform, they're mesmerised by the ability for you to apply the old SMEAC sort of appreciation and knock up a plan. They think this is some sort of magic. They also see you as being enormously expensive in the public sector. They see you as being quite unable to articulate your capability needs and deliver product in order to do that. I'm talking about the procurement process now. I've been in some horrible discussions inside the National Security Committee of Cabinet where Defence has had to lay itself bare over a catastrophe in a project. And it's not pretty. We're talking serious sums of money and it does enormous damage. People say, well, you get $47 billion a year. What's going on here? You've got a helicopter that we're about to sell to the New Zealanders has never done an operational hour. You can't turn left if you're over 4'6" because you can't move the cyclic because we changed where it was. And if you fire one of the Hellfire missiles, it tips upside down because of the centre of gravity on the aircraft. I mean, these are conversations that happen in a cabinet room and you're sitting there thinking, I can't believe this. So there is a need, I think, for us to really tighten up on the kind of whole procurement thing and look as though we are responsible, a responsible consumer of the public funds. So that's a pretty broad spread of the way. But you are not regarded, don't get too sensitive about how you're regarded positively. But you'll always be subject to some criticisms around those points that I've mentioned.
does industry have a social responsibility?
Oh, sorry, the third one, the one you addressed. Yeah, well, I personally think absolutely. And I've got, in fact, I was saying to somebody during the break, what is that? Is it some sort of, are we about to explode or something?
Yeah, all right.
The hot air from Parliament's past? Or?
Let's be resilient.
Let's be resilient. Let's be resilient. It's firing up. My experience has been that within defence industry, is the one that I know best, there is a real commitment to national defence. It's a visceral thing. I loved your point, Matt, about steering away from profit, and because that profit, I mean, it has to happen. You have to have a return on your investment, but all of the industry leaders that I have met have a high sense of obligation to the country. And look, it works even down at the workbench, because I mean, half the people that are in defence industry are former service personnel anyway. And so in a company like mine, I mean, we have a high level of social awareness of kind of what we're doing. It's become a bit stressful recently. As you know, there's a bit of a movement out there in the society about defence industry and how inappropriate it is that we're making weapons of war and so forth. That's something you've got to manage. But I can assure you that there is a sense of commitment and a sense of obligation on the part of the leadership of defence industry, any defence industry I've seen.
So we are pretty much at time. It was 2 minutes before the clock went out a moment ago. I could take one more question. We'll give you a very quick answer if there is one more question in the room. Please.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you, Brett, for your discussion. Caitlin Figueredo, Emerging Associate with the NSA. Rory, you contributed to essays to honour the late Brendan Sargent, who posed the premise of strategic imagination. Within the context of envisioning the future and encouraging creative thinking, should command, civil society, politicians, industry, whatnot, look to the principles and ideas of strategic imagination to promote holistic and proactive dialogue?
Wow, that's a great question. So for those who may not be aware, and this is someone who Duncan and I knew very well, the late Brendan Sargent, who of course was Head of Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at ANU and Associate Secretary of Defence before that, and really had a very influential leadership career in the Australian security community, was a strong champion of the idea of strategic imagination. There's a book coming out very soon, in fact, sort of honouring him, where we work on that concept of strategic imagination and try to relate its utility to the national interest, which I think is very great. Look, the only point I'd make is that it's very easy retrospectively to look at so many of the security and strategic failures of history and say it was a lack of imagination. We didn't think about what was the risk, how the adversary would operate, what's the new framework we're working in. And so I think there's an enormous case for trying to synthesise, the highly professional and technical approach that is necessary in an effective defence force and effective security community, with that sort of slightly intangible layer of thinking about what ifs. That's all I would say at the moment. With that alarm going, no, it's stopped now. But no, so is that an injunction to everyone in the room to read more fiction? Yes, it is. I'm not sure to what extent the Chief is going to condone sort of watching movies and Netflix as kind of a part of the professional development experience, but I think the more that you can think about plausible alternative futures, a lot of which is actually captured very effectively through sort of creative arts and through fiction rather than simply through a more scientific study, the better. If you can synthesise that with your professional and technical excellence, then I think you will stay one step ahead.
Yeah, Brendan Sargent was a great friend of both of us, and his timely and sad passing was a loss to the nation. But Rory has very sensibly created within the National Security College a Futures Hub, and that when I've been associated from time to time with that hub as we engage with various departments of state, the great departments of state in this town, about their futures. And this comes to the issue of imagination. So, you know, imagine where are we going to be? And I mean, Defence is well positioned for this. You've got lots of people within the organisation that are capable of doing it. And I would say just be unfettered and unhindered. Get out and do it. Yeah. Imagine what is possible and what could happen, both good and bad.
I think we're at time. So I think I'll hand back to our hosts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the professors.